Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another glorious edition of Ask That. Something a little new today. We're streaming over to the YouTubes instead of the Facebooks. We thought we'd try to break things. Welcome back. We are going to talk about culture a little bit. With me today, I got Matthew McNew. Matthew, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well. How about you, Clark?
I'm doing fantastic. It is a beautiful day outside. So, before we dive into topic at hand, why don't you do a quick intro on who you are?
Sure. I'm Matthew McNew. I'm a software engineer currently located in Chicago, and I work for Pivotal Software as a consultant. So I spent a lot of time thinking about how to build up healthy, functioning software teams, largely with enterprises here in Chicago.
So, and that's what brings us here today. You and I have had a couple conversations about kind of software teams and culture and organization and the dysfunction or function of one, which is probably a topic not very well talked about. What would be your kind of short version of what does a software team kind of, I guess from the 50,000 foot view, what does the average software team actually look like?
Yeah, software teams take a lot of different representations as they are created across the industry. A lot of times we idealize software teams as a team built around a product or an existing solution, but oftentimes there's some disconnect between what they're working on and the actual software they're maintaining.
Sure. Yeah, I'm a pretty big believer that the culture, the structure of the team actually influences the end product. I don't know if you would tend to agree with that or not, but I feel like the culture, the team structure, the how things have been centered around have this have a pretty big influence on the end product.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the team itself needs to be centered around a central goal and an idea for it to be a successful team. I also believe that the structure of a team and perhaps multiple teams interacting really influence what gets built, the architecture behind what gets built, and just the ability for that organization to effectively add new functionalities and features.
Yeah. What is a team? A team can mean a lot of things. You have a team that's kind of at the product level that's broken down into multiple littler teams. Can we put a concrete definition of when we say team, what we really mean?
It's a good question. I tend to think about teams as a group of individuals dedicated around common ceremonies for developing software. So I come from a very opinionated world of software development where we staff engineers full-time to a product, working out of the same backlog.
So, but what's the opinionated piece of that?
So we practice extreme programming. So pair programming, 40 hours a week.
Sure.
8 to 5 schedule. So everyone's kind of at the core time.
Okay.
TDD, stuff like that.
Sure. So one product, one backlog?
One product, one backlog. Usually.
Where do testers fit into that?
So that's interesting because part of how we generally approach that is having the team itself TDD. So perhaps traditional testing or QA might take a bit of a different role. And if it's necessary, is kind of more of an exploratory testing as opposed to a pure quality assurance.
Sure.
For delivery.
Sure. How about architecture?
So that's the interesting thing because if we traditionally approach teams, and like a lot of times we start the simplest thing possible and have some evolutionary architecture and design. But as you start building up and creating more and more people and eventually teams, like ultimately that's really going to influence the architecture of the creation you're making.
Sure.
So the architecture is going to happen either way. So most of the teams I've been on in the last couple of years, we don't have like an architect or someone that might play that traditional role. But there's still a need to think about architecture and think about what we are building.
Yep. Yeah, like it or not, that work doesn't go away. And if not done or addressed, it will come back to say hello later on, if you will. Whether it's cost in the cloud or functions getting redone, it will certainly come back.
Yeah, absolutely. Ultimately there's value in definitely thinking about that and thinking about the decisions you're making. That's another way I always think about it. It's like these architectural decisions are being made, whether we intend to or not.
Sure. So what about team structures? I mean, what have you seen that's been bad then? If this is how things are kind of structured in your world, where have things gone wrong and why?
How I really got into like thinking about this a lot is I was working on a project. It was a kind of a modernization project. So it was working with a large enterprise that had a current system that was kind of the beating heart of their enterprise, written in COBOL. And they were like, we'd love to get this off of COBOL and into some more modern systems.
Yeah, everybody would.
So they kind of started it off and they went through an event storming exercise where they just tried to think through all the business events that take place in that architecture and tried to group that behind bounded context. To kind of think through, like, what would an ideal architecture really be? Like, if we could, with giant, broad strokes, design an architecture built around actual bounded context, actual boundaries in our domains and our business, what would it look like?
Yeah.
And the group really started building out an architecture that reflected that initial event storm exercise. However, as we started doing that, we also started spinning up more and more teams. And what we kind of saw was that each of the teams were really disconnected. Like, it was treating architecture like as this afterthought, as this idea that we'll build this architecture and we'll think about the teams separately. As teams will build up the architecture, and you just run into a lot of like awkward points right away where you're like maintaining shared services and you're talking about all these independent microservices, but the team themselves is like building things together. So you're really like seeing that Conway's Law at work, even though you had an idealized view of another architecture.
Yeah. So then what? What was the moment? I mean, did they change? Did they recognize that, or just continue to truck down the road?
I think we as an organization kind of worked to flip that and try to actually align the teams we were building with like the architecture we wanted. So we realized that perhaps that meant that some of these like shared services that every team was kind of working on, that like to spin up the whole team around that.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like that. You'll hear that ideally called like that inverse Conway's maneuver. If you want the architecture of your systems to look a certain way, go ahead and structure the teams in that structure.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying, yeah, that's ultimately kind of the steps we took.
Yeah, I often try to paint the picture of, well, how is it that you think you're going to deploy it, or how is it that you think you're going to hot patch it or hot fix it, deal with it in production, and if you can't ultimately support that, or you say, hey, we want to deploy this thing independently, kind of back into, okay, well then what does that team look like that's going to support that? Who are those people involved? What are those? And you visualize, when the things really hit the fan and you got to fix it, who are you going to call? And how's that going to work?
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking about working towards a world where people build things that they maintain, and if they don't, who does?
Yeah. What have been some of your most memorable projects and why?
All projects seem memorable, especially at the time. It's a good question, though. I think a project that really stuck with me was a project that was on perhaps a year or two ago that was kind of a data pipeline project that was attempting to digest data from an old legacy system and store it into some more modern database. And that was hard. So we spun up probably all the way up to like 7 or 8 pairs, so probably almost 14 people. And because of all that complexity, we still weren't necessarily moving past. So I think there was a lot of pressure to try to reconcile everything we were doing and all the different teams with actually what the end result was. Because even though we were ingesting all this data, loading a couple million rows from the old database into the new database on a regular basis, all we had was a really simple API to extract some basic member data.
Sure.
And I think it was memorable because of the hidden complexity that we were working with and our attempts to divide it into more than one teams and how to kind of go back to this whole architecture thing. The architecture didn't really make it easy to divide into obvious domains.
What you said go fast, and that's something that you often hear from Scrum Masters or directors, whatnot. I mean, how did they think that they were not going fast enough?
Yeah, that's always the big question, because it's hard to put a number down on what fast is, or what a good cadence or cycle time is. Sure. It's definitely one of those things that you know it when you see it, when adding some what perceived to be new functionality, or new functionality that we know can add a lot of value, has incredibly slow cycle time from ideation to in production if we're dealing with weeks.
Sure, and of course you actually have to measure all of that through the different stacks and take responsibility for features, and I think all too often the developers get pegged a little bit for not moving fast enough, but then we don't look at the requirements to see how much further they had to be flushed out or where in the organization they had to be built. So slow gets kind of always pegged on the end person in that chain and not necessarily the entirety of it. Or maybe that's just my experience.
Yeah. Obviously there's kind of depending on how you slice it and how new product development is being decided, whether it's requirements or the team themselves is trying to add new features on their own.
Sure.
It's an interesting way to slice how new features and how you're tracking that.
Right. And of course everybody slices their stuff a little bit differently based upon their own culture themselves, which nothing wrong with it, just the reality of the situation. So you can use the same words, but it doesn't really mean the same thing. Everybody says they do Agile, but they all do it a little differently.
Everyone has their own flavor.
Yeah. For those that might not be, you mentioned you do kind of an opinionated extreme programming. Can you put a little bit of a definition around that. I recognize that it's 2018, but I also recognize the fact that not everybody does that. I got to spend a few years doing it myself, which is fantastic, but I don't think the majority of people do.
Yeah, absolutely. So extreme programming is a bit shocking for folks that perhaps haven't seen it. When you think the name, you think like extreme programming, like it would be like extreme sport.
Yeah, it's got extreme in it, so it's got to be extreme.
And the way I always kind of like phrase it to people that haven't seen it before, it's like taking the ideas that are good in software development and like just taking them up to 11. So if collaboration's good, like let's collaborate all the time. Like if co-location's good, let's always be working together. If testing is good, like let's drive everything via tests. So it originated from Kent Beck, kind of in the 90s, who you might know from the like TDD fame. And there's kind of a set of like core XP principles, but what that like means for us on a day-to-day basis is, we do development in pairs, which means, we have 2 software developments working on the same machine, working together, adding new functionality, working the same code base. You're test driving, so you don't really add any new features and functionality until you have a failing test. You are co-located with your customer or product owner to like mean that you're not trying to work off some requirements doc, but you're ideally building your features and functionality like directly as close to the user as possible. And then obviously CI, CD.
Sure.
Continually integrating your code.
Yeah. How often do you guys switch who's driving the keyboard?
So there's a lot of different ways to kind of tackle that. And you'll hear like driver navigator patterns, where like one person's driving, one person's not. I usually, at least for myself and most of the teams I've been on, have been a little more loose with that. Well, we have everyone have their own screen, their own keyboard, and their own mouse. So we're usually kind of both working together. We kind of play it by ear. But sometimes when you have like a strong differential in how experienced they are or how much context they have, it's useful to like ping pong pair or like have a navigator or driver.
You used any of the new features in, I'm not sure what editor you use, but Adam released some shared, what would be a good name for it? I don't know, shared, you could share a session and both be editing kind of in the same window, like a Google Apps would. Have you guys used any of that stuff yet?
I've heard about it and seen it, but I haven't really had a chance to give it a shot. Have you?
No, I haven't either. But I think back to my XP days, and it would be kind of interesting to have 2 people collaborating in that way. Certainly for us remote people, that's a fun way, but interesting to see where it's going to go.
Yeah, I'd definitely be interested to try it the next time I'm working remote.
Yeah. How about switching pairs? How often do you switch who you're working with?
We try to. So usually most of the teams I've been on are kind of are coaching now. Work to like switch pairs probably every day, if not more. Oh. And perhaps team members themselves might be rotating every couple of months.
Yeah, that's pretty often. How long of what's your typical sprint length? I know this is always a good fun debate of.
So in our kind of opinionated way, we usually like lean towards 1 week iterations.
Okay.
But kind of avoid like committing to block of work you might see sometimes.
Sure.
In sprints.
Sure. See, where else? Where else can we go with culture? It's such a big topic.
What's the culture like on some of the teams that you worked on in the last couple of years?
Well, I have been on all remote teams. I've been on a number of mixed teams where you have some people who are remote, some are not. I've been on ones that are all remote, all co-located. I would agree in the sense that it's hard. You were talking about earlier when if one is good, then kind of doing it all the way is great. It's hard to be a remote person if 90%, 95% of everybody else is co-located. It's depending on the team structure, that doesn't work. But we are certainly in this global world, so some of the best teams I've been part of have been global in nature, and there's a lot of things that that can happen and can be influenced in different ways when you have such a diverse group of people. But time zones are challenging, and so that puts some pressure on how work is divvied up, if you will, and where the responsibilities lie. Always the best projects have always had tons of automation around them. All the stupid stuff was automated. Nobody was messing with builds unless they really needed to, or deployments. Like that stuff is always on lock. But there's always dysfunctional ones too. Ones who are driving the ship a different direction.
Yeah, that automation really resonates with me because whenever you're doing something that could be automated, right, that time could be spent working on something that actually provides value instead of like kicking off some deploy or solving some repeatable process.
Yeah, it's a hard thing, right? Automation is hard in the sense that you think you know what you want to do, but then to do it well does take a lot of work. You have to be pretty flexible in what you're building and how you're going to automate it and where it's going to go, and you have to have the right security access to do the things you do. But if everybody's bought in and you do it, it's a dream, and it saves a ton of time. But you do have to continue to invest in it and mature it as the products mature and move. So there's no silver bullet. There's a lot of really great languages to help you do it, but there's no silver bullet.
Yeah.
Most of the automation stuff I've seen has been a combination of tools as well. It hasn't been just a tool, but there are always the big enterprises who are like, use this one thing, it'll do all the stuff, until you get about halfway into it and you're like, it'll do some of the stuff. We could do it all. Another 50% is going to be really hard to try to pull off when we could just be done if we use this other thing.
What do you find is the hardest part of your workflow to usually automate?
Environments.
Like deploy, setup.
Yep. Tear down. Data. But it depends on how far you go with testing. So if you're going to go front to back and you've got to script out data, it's fine. It's easy to do. Depends on how much you need. Depends on where it's got to go. Do you have the access to do it? Do you have to get other systems prepped in the same state, push through approvals, arbitrary approvals, because somebody wants to rubber stamp something? It's never really a technical thing as much as it is lining up all the workflow around arbitrary decisions.
Yeah, automating human workflows oftentimes.
So at the end of every one of these, I like to acknowledge the other person, and you and I have had a couple conversations, and I want to acknowledge you just for kind of taking that step and reaching out and asking questions and being involved. I think it's it's not always easy to do said thing, and just compliment you on going ahead and doing that. Which brings me to my last question for you. And it's one that I ask everybody, is what does community mean to you? Or let me rephrase that. How would you define community, and what does it mean to you?
I think community is about individuals that that think about a greater good, or a greater something greater than themselves. So I think community is kind of, to me, is like the ability to share like learnings and ideas from others, as well as just like where I think I value community is like the ability to just like share something I'm thinking about or working on, like kind of like leave me your own mind, right? Like everything works well, or everything's a great idea when it's all in your mind, or it's all in your like little sphere.
Yeah, for sure. It always works in your mind. Works on my machine. Everything's fine.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, sir. Well, thank you for the time today. Everybody, thank you for spending your time with us. Leave some notes below. Leave some comments below on team structures, cultures that's worked well for you. Maybe where you've had hard points, great points, whatever. Share alike. Share as part of the community. Matthew, thank you for the time here today. Where can people find more about you?
Feel free to hit me up on Twitter. Go to my website, mattmcnew.com. Or send me an email.
Work? Yeah, those places work. We'll link them. We'll link them below. Leave us a comment. Drop us a line. And with that, thank you, Matthew, for today. And we'll see everybody next time.
Thanks, everyone.